Hello, and welcome to a double bill of episodes. This is number 38 and number 39, where I shall be talking about King Edward V and King Richard III. Edward V was only 12 when he succeeded his father, Edward IV. Edward IV was only about 43 when he died, which was considered to be quite young, and therefore his death was unexpected. Edward was still receiving his training to become king in Wales, and so Elizabeth Woodville immediately thought, okay, well, the vultures will be circling at this point because of his age, so we should probably transport him to London and get him crowned immediately. Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, however, namely Edward IV's younger brother, foresaw this and intercepted Edward's entourage and put Edward in the Tower of London, and he became one of the princes in the Tower. And so Elizabeth was a bit annoyed about this, right, obviously. The Great Council of England made Richard Lord Protector, and what Edward thought was neither here or there, because he was still stuck in the Tower. And obviously Elizabeth Woodville protested at this. Richard was declared king in 1483, and because he'd raised an army and brought it to London to make sure that everyone believed he should be king. And the princes were smothered because Edward V had a younger brother called Richard, also called Richard, and he had actually taken sanctuary with Elizabeth Woodville in Westminster Abbey, but eventually Richard was forced to yield to Richard of Gloucester, who put him in the tower of his brother, and they were probably smothered to death, the two princes in the tower. Now, I think Edward V's body was found in Tower of London in the 1670s under the reign of Charles II, and he was buried at Westminster Abbey. Obviously, you can't disinter a body from Westminster Abbey like that, so we can't quite be sure whether it was Edward V's. But it's quite nice he's got a memorial, and the way Richard became king and kind of violated the laws of succession there quite blatantly, it was basically one of the prime causes to why Henry Tudor came back and then basically took the throne and established the Tudor dynasty. Anyhow, so there was a rebellion because obviously, as I just mentioned, he wasn't the rightful heir to the throne. The Duke of Buckingham rebelled, loyalists to Edward IV and Edward V, but they were defeated by Richard. He was quite a competent military commander. And there was also conniving between Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort. Now, you might remember Margaret Beaufort was the descendant of John of Gaunt through John of Gaunt's third marriage, and therefore, obviously descended from Edward III. Margaret Beaufort's son, Henry the Tudor, had been forced into exile, because obviously Elizabeth Woodville's children were dead, so that meant that they had something kind of in common, so they connived and said that Henry Tudor should marry Elizabeth, who was Elizabeth Woodville and Edward IV's daughter. It's quite interesting, actually, because both Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York and all of Elizabeth's sisters and brothers were declared illegitimate by Richard, so it all seemed like very much an opposition move, if you see what I mean. And the opposition eventually therefore coalesced around Henry Tudor. He was seen as the last Lancastrian claimant to the throne, especially in the face of Richard, who had basically usurped the throne from his nephew. And Henry Tudor arrived in England in 1485, and most people will know the Battle of Bosworth did not go Richard's way. I think he was trying to challenge Henry Tudor to combat during the battle, but then obviously the intervention of Lord Stanley from atop the hill kind of made it so that Richard would lose, and I think Richard was cut down. Obviously Shakespeare's gives him the last words, like a horse, a kingdom for a horse. Not sure if he actually said that or not, but it's quite interesting, of course, his burial, because obviously his body was found under a car park in Leicester, because I think he was buried at the monastery that was in Leicester, or the abbey, and obviously during dissolution of the monasteries in 1536, the abbey was destroyed or desecrated, which meant that Richard's body, no one cared about it because no one knew where it was until 2015, I think, when it was reburied, which I think was really cool, actually, seeing that again. And obviously when his body was, when people saw his body, they were able to do facial reconstructions, they were able to see which diseases he might have had. Shakespeare, of course, in terms of popular culture, had portrayed Richard as a hunchback, and of course a schema too, but actually he probably only had sclerosis, which does not correlate or does not mean he was a hunchback. And actually, during the reign of Edward IV, Richard was very, very loyal to Edward, which does raise some questions as to why suddenly he had a change of heart and thought Edward V was somehow completely incompetent. Maybe he thought he hadn't been properly rewarded for his loyalty, even though he'd been given basically complete dominion over the north of England during Edward's second reign. So I don't know what to really think about that, to be honest. Maybe he thought that Edward V, being so young and impressionable, would be under the thumb of Elizabeth Woodville, and as I mentioned in Edward IV's podcast, Elizabeth Woodville was very ambitious for her own ends and family, very protective, and probably would want to cut out Richard from any influence over the young king, so Richard thought it better to just completely shut him out of the government, and therefore her out of the government. But in the end, I guess in a sense, Elizabeth Woodville had the last laugh because her daughter would marry Henry Tudor, and obviously the Tudor Rose would come into play there, uniting Lancaster and York. So I think generally, obviously Shakespeare, as you might remember, is commonly said, he was trying to pander to Elizabeth I, and trying to make the Tudor succession seem legitimate and Richard seem like a tyrant. But I don't think he was a tyrant, really. I think the way he usurped the throne was, clearly a little bit objectionable. But the reports say he wasn't actually a bad king. He was quite good to the commoners. He cared about the common folk, and wanted to stick by the Fortescue provisions. Saying about English liberty. He wasn't as awful as Shakespeare portrayed him. So in a way, you could say history's been a little bit unkind to Richard. But really, if he hadn't usurped the throne, history might be like, yeah, he was a decent guy. No questions asked. But such is. Anyhow, that is the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, because technically they are all still Plantagenets until Henry Tudor comes along. So I will see you for the Tudor dynasty beginning in the next episode. Thank you very much. Goodbye.